Hi there, it's me, Marcus, hiding behind a PowerPoint slide for a moment. FUT202 Lecture 4, we're exploring practices that I guess help put into action the thinking around futures senses, the thinking and feeling around doing futures. Futures thinking, futures feeling. And it's very much about what we do with people's bodies in workshops and how we link that to the social realities of the workshoppers, and of course drawing on our own background in our own practices, whether you're an artist, a gamer, a singer, a dancer, or perhaps an academic who plays with ideas and thoughts. Doesn't matter how we go with it, there are different ways of doing the futures senses. In fact, this book here, Futures Thinking for Social Foresight, put that over there, okay, is it's a compendium of all sorts of futures tools that you can use. There is, it's available as a PowerPoint, and not PowerPoint, as a PDF for you in Futures 101, and I may have moved it over to Futures 202. I'm not sure. One of you can go and check it for me and see if you can find it. But, you know, my point is that any of those tools, if you bring in the right kind of mental approach, can be used to explore the future sense of memory, or the future sense of foresight, future sense of voice, optimism, or yearning. Okay, so it's very much about how we think and our intentionality in the actual enactment of futuring. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to that slide that I was hiding behind. There I am in Sweden, west of Västra Gotland, West Gotland, which is right on the border between Sweden and Norway, where 3,500 or so years ago, a bunch of Bronze Age and Iron Age people were living, and they spent their times at different times looking out over the sea and leaving these petroglyphs on the rocks. Now, I love being in places like that. It just, my whole being comes alive. And it comes alive because part of me is being called to time travel, you know, to actually think and feel about the landscape I'm in and the kind of world that these people inhabited, world so alien to us that my imaginings are possibly mostly romantic as opposed to real, but certainly they experience cold and hunger, they experience love and all sorts of imaginative things. And, you know, the imagination is all over these rocks. And because I'm the kind of person I am, you know, I get into geeky sorts of moods. I have rock patterns from here tattooed on my back, which gives me a great sense of glee when I have to sit with some really serious, boring university officials or something like that. I go, hee hee hee, you don't know. So it's also a way of subverting the realities of you know, having to live and work in the university. But that's on the side. So let's get moving. And that personal, intimate sense of being part of the world that I'm experiencing there, standing right next to those ancient petroglyphs, is something I want you to start feeling into, leaning into, as they say. So let me get moving then. So, talking about the intimate, sensory futures is one way we experience intimacy. Okay, this was written just before I pulled together the future senses framework that I'm using, but it's all over this statement. So these futures, sensory futures, point to how our bodies themselves inform our future senses. Sense is the operative word, as the world is mediated through our senses, which provide much of the constant flow of information that we process. Our consciousness, which is deeply shaped by sensory perception and associated memories, is in fact intimately sensual. It shapes what is accessible to us across time. So that we're talking about a consciousness, and we're developing a certain kind of understanding of consciousness. Consciousness is not just the thought processes that go in our head. It's the entirety of our bodily sensorial appreciation of being embedded in the world. That's really important. And from the sensorial, we then get the cultural, because the culture and our senses, as I've said in previous lectures, are intimately entwined. So, what can I say? This kind of reiterates what I was saying about the Futures Thinking book, actually. We can create environments that are safe and allow for reflection and fragments of memory to coalesce. Okay, that's when we pay attention, our intention. All our futures tools can come to serve this work of memoryscaping through the futures senses. So it's how we use them that matters. Wayfinding also is an invitation to return to our culture's treasures and revitalize them. So take the futures triangle, take the three horizons, take any futures tool you like, emergent issues analysis, scenarios, whatever you want, CLA of course. They all can come to the service of the futures senses. But what do we say about these cultural treasures and how do we revitalize them? Well, there's a magic that comes about. Morris Berman wrote about that years ago. 1981, this book came out, Re-Enchanting the World. And then much more recently, Adrienne Marie Brown, just last year, came out with a book called Loving Corrections. And, you know, those thinkers are making a case for wayfinding, using our senses, using the entirety of our bodies and the resources of our cultures to reframe our orientation to the future. Okay, and that begins, of course, with memory and storytelling. So let's turn to the work of the wonderful Marguerite Westacott. Okay, Marguerite is a long-term friend of mine, and she's been playing with the future senses. She's a great teacher, and she runs workshops all over the place in this kind of space. So what does she have to tell us? Well, first of all, when she starts out with one of her workshops, which are always usually, I would say, arts-based, she kind of gives some context. Here's some context from one of her papers. Memory is provoked consciously or viscerally through emotions, sounds, images, thoughts, and physical sensations that are located in relationship with the environment. So she uses that word intimate. Look, these are intimately embodied. Memory connects and individualizes. It can be constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed on personal, societal levels and can transcend generations. So she offers what, in this paper, she offers a career timeline, which is a simple little device, and she says this timeline can summon other voices, actual, ancestral, or future. So it folds, okay, the timeline folds. It could be spiral or cyclical as well as linear. The expanding this activity to acknowledge the co-creation of many voices that contribute to one's career story creates a deeper understanding of how culture builds the perimeters of thinking and challenges perceptions of career as an individual pursuit. In other words, career is embedded in broader cultural stories. And, you know, we can play with timelines for all sorts of good futures reasons. The good futures timeline, bad futures timeline. The history of the planets, or the history of the universe, cosmic timelines, and so on. They're all useful. And if you start using timelines in a creative way, you can then understand that a timeline, though it looks to be linear in some sense, is actually very much like this roadmap here, moving around cyclical circles and up and down, a bit like a snakes and ladders or something. We can understand that careers are part of social forms. I was thinking just recently, because I'm teaching history at the university, on, you know, what was it like in an early city, perhaps Uruk in Mesopotamia. where somebody would be a potter or a soldier or a scribe or a nurse or an apothecary or a mother. All of these careers were located within an urban context that was totally brand new. But, you know, given the short-term nature of human memory, they would, people who lived in that city 3,500, 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, no, not quite 5,000 years ago, but very close to, you know, they, only a generation or two before might have been gatherer hunters. But now they're in a city and they actually have a career, but that career is located to the technology, located within the social and technological limitations, the perimeters that Marguerite's talking about there, that define our sense of identity and what we can do and what we're capable of doing. So the career collage is where Marguerite goes next in the same paper. And I've got a bit more. We'll unpack the career collage because that's something that Marguerite's been working on consistently, I think, over the last few years. It's an art therapy technique. And of course, Marguerite, well, I say of course, you don't know this, but Marguerite's trained in art therapy as well as being trained as a teacher. And yeah, and an artist proper, which she did art school many years ago. So encourage the student's subconscious to emerge and to quote, to express unknown, forgotten or unacknowledged future goals and to discover and explore unique qualities in themselves. So this tool requires participants to phenomenologically, great word, respond to collage media as they contemplate a career theme, a question or an issue. Collage media, magazines, materials, could be natural stuff from outside, leaves and so on. Can be many kinds of things. A collage is basically a smorgasbord of stimuli. How does that sound? So let's have a quick look at then how Marguerite's been doing. This is from a work that she uses to actually do a CLA. Believe it or not. This is the iceberg in the room collage that she's got here, and you can see that she's got mapping going on there. There are maps down here in the bottom right hand corner. You can see it quite clearly. And overlaid, she's got all sorts of materials added to the image to create this rather splendid piece of work. You can read all about that in her 2024 paper, The Iceberg in the Room, which actually just won an honourable mention in the awards of the Association of Professional Futurists. So we're all totally stoked about that. Moving on then, so she's looking at, and this is from that paper, the 2024 paper, memory maps and sense making. She makes this point: maps are appearing as a regular motif in my art making. That's hers, right? Maps embody foresight. In the elements of the maps, I recognize the possibilities that have drawn me to the field of future studies. I'm really happy she's come to the field of future studies, looking at futures conscious and anticipatory aesthetic of the future senses. Studying futures invites possibilities, alternatives, recognition of complexity, chaos, and contradictions. The maps embrace layers and non-linear interactions. Possibility, imagination, and creativity have brought me to the field of future studies. Futures are represented in the many layers of this artwork that we just saw before, that one. Okay? They invite alternatives, which ultimately, I hope, reveal new knowledge and new ways of thinking. And I'm just realizing that what I'm talking about here is this is not the Iceberg in the Room paper. That's one of her other papers. This is the chapter tributaries that she wrote for my book, Passion and Purpose in the Humanities. So yeah, getting myself mixed up, not paying attention. So let's go and collage together. Let's have a bit of fun. This is Marguerite having fun. 3 of these images are from Marguerite. The boring one on the far left there, that was one collaging activity that I was part of. Doesn't compare to Marguerite's. in Sweden. But you can see the same thing at work. There's lots of post-it notes, images, and all layered together and so on there. But here in Marguerite's work, you can see that the participants have a much more creative space and a wider variety of materials that they can draw on, magazines and so on. There's glue sticks and they can write into things that they want. And also, Marguerite provided every participant there, and you can't really see them here, with sections of maps themselves. The actual paper, this paper up here, these are all maps as well. So she was able to, through a great chance find, introduce maps as actually the basis out of which grew the collaging. And here we can see people standing around. They're all laid out their collages, and people can walk up and down and ask questions, tell stories, and so on. It's very communal, very interactive, very reflective. And the trick is, and Marguerite does this really well, is to guide people through questions and observations, statements like the ones that I was reading you before, maps appearing regularly, she says, and she'll talk about her own art practice, as well as giving instructions about, well, what does Future's memory work like, and so on. So this is using memory, but then she moves into foresight and voice and so on. So it's actually a kind of like a conveyor belt of Future's sensing. So we start off with memory and we work through to yearning. Well, that's Marguerite's work. Now I'm going to jump to one of the activities that I've run, called the Future's Mirror. The Future's Mirror, and that's a little template there. It's a template that I sometimes use just to help some people who get a little bit overwhelmed by being asked to do creative stuff. That's a template for a mask. Let's have a look. So in 2019, when I was in Brazil, after being there, I wrote this little piece up, which you can find here, this link here, that link there. It's online, it's not a formal publication, but I make this point. The future acts as a mirror for our times, but like all mirrors, aspects of the futures before us are distorted. The cultural lens that shapes our perception, or by our configuration of values and emotions. It's the sort of stuff that I've been talking about for the last few weeks. Dealing with cultural conditioning then, and our personal values emotional template is key, okay, or are two keys of Future's work. And this is important. So the Future's mirror is this sense that the future actually mirrors us. But what happens if I actually physically bring a mirror into the room and run an activity? Well, I'm going to tell you about that. So I've got this workshop that I run occasionally called the Future's Mirror, and it's inspired by voice dialogue, which was introduced to me by Sir Halen Ayatollah. It comes from the work of Hal and Sidra Stone. Okay, it seeks to embody emotional dimensions for engaging Future's action and reflection, and to voice them through a creative practice involving engagement and also monologue. Let me tell you more. So, bing, overview then. I'll take a deep breath because this is a long statement, but basically it walks you through the logic. Masks can be made with anything. And if you know your history, you'll know that masks go back to the very beginning of human social behavior. The main thing is that participants work in silence and allow the mask to appear before them through the accidents and choices encountered in creative process. This is messy, of course, because it's an artistic process. Glue and paper and feathers and anything else you want to bring in. I'll bring in grasses and leaves and all kinds of stuff to the room or the students go and find them. This is messy, with each mask maker working according to their own inner dynamic. Some finish construction quickly, while others are slow. When the mask is done, they put it on and stand in silence before a mirror. They listen for what the mask is telling them. This is really important, that they take on the persona of their mask and they listen to what that persona is telling them. It might be a whisper, or it might be a really loud yell of rage. This is an intuitional space where the persona or voice of the mask is invited to speak from the silence. Each participant must be patient. When they get a message from the masked self, they write it down and hang it, both mask and message, on the wall. Masks are usually anonymous, and eventually the wall is full and the task done. The participants relax and laugh. Sometimes even they get quite emotional and cry. So basically it runs like this. Choose a voice, and I've run them through beforehand, and I'm actually putting up the initial, I think it was almost the initial PowerPoint that I ran when I was in Taiwan. I ran this back in 2013 or 12, sometime like that. It ended up being written up in that paper, Intimate Futures, that I've been quoting from. But, you know, I run them through a range of what voices are available, and I'll talk about cultural voices in relation to the Chinese sort of cultural memories bank, but then I give them these ones as well. The righteous voice, or the scared voice, the angry voice, the sad voice, the hopeful voice, sustainable voice, the consumer voice, and so on. We will sometimes play around with voices before we start the actual physical construction of the mask. Then I say, take a mask template, could be the little template I showed you before, but many times students will go and make their own and decorate it to fit your voice. With the mask, stand before the mirror and look at yourself. What do you see? What does your voice say to the world? It might say, I'm really sorry, the trees are coming down, and so on. Or it might say, it's a joy to be on the planet with my feet on the ground. Or it might whisper half-articulated things too. Voice can be very, very subtle and sensitive. Sometimes it can just be, I am pissed off and I really want you guys out there to start doing something to help the world become a better place for animals or plants or whatever it is that's frustrating you. So, speaking in a voice, sit in silence, capture this. Pin the message and the mask, as you can see in the image here, to the wall. When all masks and messages are on the wall, the groups move about and look at all the voices. How do you feel is my main question at the end there. These students here, they're master students in their mid-20s, though they look very young to me nowadays, but you know, they're young adults in their mid-20s, master's students at Tam Kung University in Taiwan, and you can see a range of the masks behind them there. They thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was really quite an amazing experience working with them. But the first group that I worked with were a group of academics who were at a conference, again at Tam Kung University, and they, some of them found it rather confronting. They found it confronting because there's one woman who came up to me, she was really overwhelmed, said, I'm really scared about doing anything creative with the visual arts. Turns out she'd been, somebody in her primary school had told her she was really bad at it or something. And I had to stand near her while she constructed a mask, but she constructed the mask and was overwhelmed with this sense of, I've actually, she was almost like she'd cast some evil spirit out, and she felt expanded, elated, optimistic, and all those other feelings that came with doing her mask. Very, very interesting. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. But beforehand, look, we've got to acknowledge the work of voice. Suppressing a voice gives it power. Addressing our voices gives their space and builds a dynamic field of being. This field is both individual and collective. Voice here, so this could be the future sense of voice. But what I'm interested about the mask work in this context is its ability to draw on the past, on memory, as students or workshop participants engage in the building of masks. I've just popped this little poem in here because it speaks to the fears that this woman had that I was telling you about. So the next time you refuse to sing because you'll never fill a stadium, or decline the joy of dance for fear of looking ridiculous, or you resist risking the new adventure because you're not entirely ready, or you dim your shine because you're not completely healed. Okay, the next time, okay, so show up, sing, shine, she concludes at the end there of the poem. So basically that's just an affirmation poem, but it means that when you can often meet resistance in workshops, especially workshops that involve dance, movement, whatever. Be gentle, be supportive, allow the person to work through their own dimming, their own fear of risk-taking and being ridiculous, and allow them to come out the other end, so that, as in the last sentence there, or the last few lines, show up, sing, shine, the world needs you as you are, is affirmed. Big breath for me. So movement, the grace hack. This is me in Brazil playing with masters and PhD students at a university. It's the university that I write about a little bit in that Medium article from 2019. Okay, so I want to talk about the grace hack and just a little. So in the hacking of memory through movement, what do we do? Well, I set the scene by introducing forms like the one-hand dance I have introduced to you already. And I give a series of basic, simple forms: walk, stop, run, moving around, playing some music. Once I've created that environment, okay, and I can feel the energy starting to rise, I then set a theme. The theme that I was working with 2 years ago was on the future city, okay, or city futures, urban imaginaries, okay. And I basically said, look, visualize or imagine a city you know well, okay. Then I'll start a simple story and I'll get them moving around. Let's say you're walking the streets of a large city, crowds are thick and you're late for an appointment. I play some music and let them play it out, and then I stop. I ask them to pair and to share. Okay, here people are doing just that. These are all photos from Bram Goots, who very kindly gave me permission to use the images he took. And you can see groups of people and individual people laughing and having fun. Okay, this is what I think of as memoryscaping, and I use the interplay techniques that I've mentioned to you before as a grace hack. Dopamine and imagination are a fantastic combination, and these students, we would do this every day for 5 days. The first session in the morning I led, and we walked through this wonderful process. Each day the theme changed and so on. I've written a short paper on it that's coming out in a book. Signed the contract off on the chapter and everything. I will put up a proof of that. There are a few little spots that I spotted little errors, but yeah, I'll put the proof up on to share for you, so you can read more about it if this kind of work interests you. But the point is that I use this to get people to remember, to look at their memories of the urban, then also look at their cultural memories and so on. It's a really deep process. Moving on, another one. What about the Futures Triangle? Well, I keep on, I've talked about the Futures Triangle in multiple contexts. I think it's a terrific tool, but I've used it for embodied practice too. 2008 or 9, I was in Sweden and I got people there to enact the Futures Triangle. 3 groups of people being, the past, the present, and the future, and it worked a treat. Then I had a lot of fun. April of this year, where I used an interplay form called the DT3. That's dance, talk 3 times. Dance, talk, dance, talk, dance, talk. And I used the title of my book, Neo-Humanism, Yearning and Becoming, as a DT3 theme. And I danced and talked at the opening of a Futures Symposium, the Oceania Futures Symposium. I only had 5 minutes to do it. And, I did it deliberately because as a person who's seen as an academic or an intellectual person, I'm often seen as the guy who can just get up and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to say, look, futures work needs to be exciting, different, and challenging. So, moving from the Futures Triangle, because this is only one slide, I want to move to the question of death, which is one of my favorite topics. Whoa, look at that. Death futures is something that I've been working on for a while. And, you know, I'm a member of the Australian Death Studies Society. Can you imagine having a Death Studies Society? Well, I'm a member, have been for quite a few years now. When I was in Portugal, one of the workshops I ran was a Death Futures workshop, okay? And it was built around ritual and the kind of rituals that human beings over time have done regarding body disposition. That means, what do we do with the dead body once it's dead? And what do we do with grandma, or what do we do with my son? Here I had a young man who was my assistant play dead, and I set up the room like this with these little candles around. He was a good guitarist, so we put a guitar at his feet. We gave some other tools here, a knife and drink bottles and so on. The kind of things that would have been put with a body maybe 5,000 years ago and buried, and archaeologists dig them up and they go, ooh, look at this, and this is a wonderful brooch, or look, the leather's all gone, but we can still got the belt buckle, you know, that sort of stuff. So I did that, and then I got people to come in silence, and there was music playing around that was really atmospheric. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm drawing on deep cultural memories around death, where the symbolism here with this body lying in state like this is deliberately designed to evoke emotions and memory and associations. So death futures and emergent ritual workshops like this one, which actually never got off the ground because Monica ended up not being able to come, so we changed it. It morphed, but it was built around this kind of thing. And I've run a number of death futures workshops over time, and if you're interested, we can run one together. Just come and see me, and we'll work it out, or invite me to your place. We've run this in Sweden, we've run them in Portugal, and other places overseas, as well as in Australia. All right, and you can see this is the flyer. I say the modern approach to death, dying, and body disposal is increasingly problematic socially and environmentally. Socially, there is discomfort around death. We don't talk about, oh, my dad died. You say, oh, he passed away, and that sort of stuff. We hide the dying in institutions. Okay, these are called, you know, funeral businesses. And when we turn to body disposal, we are faced with a large expenditures of energy. You know, and if we choose cremation or alienating a chunk of land in perpetuity, we choose burial. So this is the sort of thing. Now, how did I approach this? By getting people to think about what they would do, how we did it in the past, like the image of the boy lying there with the lights all around him. My friend Keith put the ashes of his wife and his father into this boat that he made. He's an incredibly skilled carpenter, and he lit it alight for a Viking burial. And I had worked with his wife. I knew his wife quite well. She was a lovely person. And so, you know, this is one way that body disposal might take place. But what I do in these death workshops is to say, well, what's your memory of death and dying? And this is the kind of memory that most people have. We've all been to funerals, or at least by my age you've been to funerals many times, and you've got the casket, and you know it's red, you know, you've got somebody in black or something like that reading out a eulogy and so on. But I want to look at alternative futures for death. So we take the memory of death and we start casting into the future, saying, well, what does technology do? Technologies like the technology of fire, which has been used for thousands of years, especially in some cultures like in India or the Scandinavian culture, this Viking boat. But what happens if we do an aquamation where the body is placed within a fluid and is very quickly decomposed? So Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop of South Africa and then Cardinal, he chose aquamation for the disposal of his body. Or what happens if you go for human composting? You know, the human composting movement, and it's picking up in Australia. It's now legal in South Australia, I believe. The body is disposed of very quickly. It takes about a month in both of these cases for the body to be entirely reduced to its core elements. Well, what happens if you, and this is a young woman giving a TED talk here, she designed a fungi suit where the body was decomposed by mycelium and so on. So if we have different forms of technology, how might we ritualize the process of death, okay, and play with that? So I've had people, now I don't have images of them, but I've done it where we actually created a ritual around death. We did it in Portugal for that young man, and we also did it in Sweden, where we created a ritual around the death of a child, an imagined death of a child. There was no child sacrifice in that case. So death is or can be personal. Here we've got Graham Chapman's wonderful funeral with the hilarious eulogy by John Cleese. Graham Chapman, when he was dying, famous Monty Python member, had said to John Cleese, look, when you do my funeral, which of course I know is going to happen and it's going to happen very soon, I want you to be the first person to say fuck at a funeral eulogy. Okay, so John Cleese made a lot of, got a lot of traction out of that. Very funny, but also very rich in pathos and so on. So think about a funeral or similar service that you've attended. This is for you to think about now. Okay, this is a little job, and we'll be doing this in our workshop. So think about it. How did you feel at the funeral? Were you devastated, or was it, oh, thank God Uncle Frank is gone? You know, it could be anything like that. Was there grief? Has the experience made you think about how you would like to be farewelled? These are important questions. I want you to list images and feelings, words and phrases that you would associate with death. Then, so how do we deal with this? Well, there's a paradox in being human. We are fearful and trusting. I think we'd be probably foolish to deny that there would be some anxiety around the thought of our own deaths. We're vulnerable and yet brave. We are conditioned by our society, but we're also creative. We can be cruel, but loving. Okay, task 1. I want you to spend 5 minutes making a list of human qualities you recognize, human qualities that you might admire or dislike. So you've got 5 minutes to do that. This is a workshop. As I run it or ran it quite a number of times now. So this is a slide that I take, that's part of my workshop. Okay, then I do a dialoguing. Share your list and ask the following question. What life experiences have fostered this view of nature, human nature? In other words, what memories, what life experiences? So this is the personal memory bank now. Okay, when I've done that, I might jump to a CLA. Then I'll get participants to start thinking, well, what's the litany for death and dying and the death technologies, the funeral parlors and so on, the industrial model and the relational model, the system level, industrial, relational, and so on. We fill out that. We're going to try and do some of these things in the workshop that we run in the following weekend, okay? So we can move on then to thinking about poetics. So I was walking you through the activities that I run around death there, linking them to the future's sense of memory, but of course they bleed into one another, and this is something you will experience in all these sessions. But I want to say this about poetry, because the next thing I'm going to turn to is something that Cynthia Dillard talks about, the praise song. Okay, and I pick it up and discuss it in the last session. So I want to come to that next. So poetics and poetry. Poets are the archaeologists of culture. I want you to think about that. Poets go and we find metaphors, and then we apply them here, there, or everywhere. We use language in creative ways. Poets plumb its depth, that's the depth of culture, for the new that lies at the heart of the old, creative traditionalism, okay? And they give this enriched, re-enchanted thing back to us in forms that move us beyond our present fixation
to new possibilities. Okay, so poets and poetry are really important. Even how you use language in your sessions that you will run will have an impact on those who hear you. So let's turn then to the praise song. Memory and the praise song. Something I came across just recently, and I'm sharing it with you, is a wonderful thesis from an African scholar who just finished a couple of years ago her PhD, and she's looking at Sankofa. It's a Ghanaian process. The Sankofa is a symbol, this bird here, deeply rooted in the wisdom of Ghana's Akan people, depicts a bird turning its head backward to retrieve an egg. A reminder that true progress demands that we draw from the lessons of the past, in other words, memory. Okay, so the praise song is important, and she opens her thesis with a praise song, and I'm just taking a slice of that praise song. Sankofa whispers, that's the bird whispers. In an attempt to understand what Sankofa means to me, as a reluctant archivist, I look for all the material I can find in the unconstituted archive of my world, the memory, the oral histories. I am reluctant because I am not sure I believe in the ark of archive. That means the cache. I refuse the formality of it, the records and the documents, the requests that need to be made. You have to submit a request to the archive. Can I see the filing box this, or can I see the manuscript that? The supposed objectivity of it. Oh, I've got the letters of William Shakespeare in my hand and it's objective. Well, it's not really. You just think it is, because William Shakespeare might have been writing to his landlord, and making up a whole, quite creative story about why he couldn't pay the rent. But what I am interested in, she says, is its traces, the fragments, the whispers and the shouts. This is the deep space of future's sense of memory that hide in documents, the things in between, the stories that are not told, the layout of the spaces, the why of the cataloguing. Okay, what's the rationale behind the way the archive is structured, and the categorizations. I'm interested in what is not there or not allowed in, that which haunts the official story, she says. The Sankofa bird often whispers to me, alive amongst the dead records, telling me to look in places other than the official for the things I need to remember. She whispers to me of places to find materials, of events and streets and people. She makes me look at the brickwork. Remember me touching on brickwork last week, and another brick in the wall, and trees and plants on market stalls, and in hairdressers, in dance moves, and in poetry. This is a slice of this beautiful Sankofa that she's offering us, a praise song that goes for 3 pages actually at the opening of a PhD. And you can see here that I've got that, there are links there to that, and I also have a link here to the PhD thesis up the top here. So you can go and download it for yourself and enjoy it. It's a very, very good piece of work. So, African appreciation for the oral, for the traditional, for the deep work of memory embedded and distributed in culture. Traditional, creative traditionalism is at work in the way this woman reworked praise song for her own scholarly and academic purposes. Let's turn to a poet of a different kind, somebody that you may know of, Emily Dickinson, the American poet from the 19th century. She said, I had no time to hate because the grave would hinder me. And life was not so ample I could finish enmity. Nor had I time to love. But since some industry must be the little toil of love, I thought, be large enough for me. In other words, she has enough. If she's going to have to focus on something, put aside hate and enmity. She will toil for love. It's a beautiful way of using language again in a form, the form of the poem, an ancient form, a form of praise singing, in a sense, to move us into alternative futures, futures that move from enmity to love, for instance. How do we sum up? Well, we sum up by pointing in other directions. So working metaphors, mining culture is what it's all about. I went with this because this is an AI. Yeah, I just typed this into the PowerPoint and they threw this at me. It's so typical of the kind of superficiality of AI, and yet it's also a powerful metaphor in a sense. We are mining culture. We're digging, like archaeologists, as I said, poets are archaeologists, right? Into culture. We're digging into culture. So where do I want to land? I want to land with the second of the two interviews that are available at the moment for this particular course, the interview with Sarah Devanzo, and looking at her mining of culture, playing with the Insight Alchemy book that she produced. It's a wonderful book. You'll find links to it on the interview page where I've got her interview. Sarah has worked in mining in a sense. She was invited in the 1990s when South Africa threw out apartheid to come and set up their gold museum, which of course has to look closely at mining. So that made her interested in cultural memory and in the processes of the Western science of alchemy. I say Western because it has a strong Western formulation, but in fact the ancient Chinese had a very strong and clear tradition of alchemy too. This book, Inside Alchemy, is fantastic, and I interview Sarah asking her about it and about the kind of embodiment, the way futures feeling works for her, and the way she has drawn on her own career experiences. Now I'm thinking of Marguerite Westcott and her work on career timelines and so on. Her career has led her to investigate gold in detail, set up museums that are built around material cultural artifacts, stories, and certain forms of histories that are designed to shape and validate the human passion for this substance called gold. And she maps it out all so elegantly in this little book, Inside Alchemy. There are many ways we can bring in the future's sense of memory into our future's thinking and practice. It's all about how to, the way the future's sense of memory is embodied and embedded in the people that we're working with, and of course we have to start off with ourselves. The intimacy of the future is as intimate for us as it is for people that we will workshop with or students and so on. I hope this has been useful. I know it feels a little bit like a potted history or a dog's breakfast, as my dad would have said long ago, but it is it's a way of pointing towards the possibilities of activating the future's sense. And I hope that in the future, when I run other iterations of this course, I've got starting to stutter, I've been talking for too long, that I might be able to draw on work on future senses that you have done, just as I'm drawing on the work of Marguerite Westcott. Thank you so much, and I look forward to exploring all of this in our workshop. See you soon.